Has anyone ever paused in the long quiet between thoughts to wonder why Europe's memory begins so abruptly? Why every textbook seems to open the same gate? Greece, marble, philosophers, the birth of reason, as though nothing of consequence had breathed across that continent before, as though the soil beneath the Parthenon had been waiting blank and obedient for someone to finally arrive and begin the world. But the soil is not blank. It never was. Beneath the rivers of the Balkans, beneath the wheat fields of Romania and the wooded hills of Serbia, beneath the still waters of the Black Sea where ancient shorelines now lie drowned 100 meters deep, there are layers. Layers older than Athens, older than Troy, older than the first stone of the pyramids at Giza, and in those layers lie the bones of cities that no schoolchild is taught to name, the ashes of homes burned in rituals no one fully understands, the symbols of a script that may predate every other script on Earth, and yet has no place in the official story of how civilization began. So before you let your body sink fully into this comfort, before the weight of the day settles into the soft dark of sleep, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what is being made here, and if you would, leave behind in the comments the city you're listening from and the hour of your local night, so that this small candle of curiosity can be traced across the map of the world's quiet listeners. Now, return to the question, because it is not a small one. The story most are told goes something like this. Humanity stumbled out of caves, learned to plant grain, built the first cities in Mesopotamia around 5,000 years before the Common Era. And from that fertile crescent the spark of civilization spread outward, eastward to the Indus, westward eventually to the Mediterranean, where the Greeks, in their golden hour, lit the lamp of Western thought. Everything in between is treated as background. Prehistory, tribes, wandering hunters. A vague mist of arrowheads and pottery shards out of which eventually real history condensed. Yet the spade has been turning up another tale for more than a century now. A tale that historians have argued over in dim lecture halls, that has been quietly relegated to footnotes, that has surfaced in obscure monographs and been buried again under the weight of older paradigms. A tale of an entire civilization, sprawling, literate or near-literate, technologically advanced for its age, peaceful in ways that defy expectation, that flourished across southeastern Europe for nearly 3,000 years, a civilization that built towns of 15,000 inhabitants when most of humanity still huddled in clusters of 50, a civilization that smelted copper before Sumer existed, that worked gold into ornaments of breathtaking refinement before the first pharaoh wore a crown, that incised symbols onto clay tablets centuries, perhaps millennia, before the cuneiform of the Tigris and Euphrates. And then, somewhere in the long centuries between 5,000 and 3,000 before the Common Era, this civilization began to fade. Its great settlements were burned, abandoned, and not rebuilt in their old form. Its symbols faded from use. Its memory, if it had once been carried in song or story, was overwritten by the languages of newcomers who arrived from the east, riding horses, speaking tongues that would one day branch into Greek and Latin and Sanskrit and English. The people of old Europe, as some scholars have come to call them, were not so much conquered in a single dramatic battle as gradually unmade, absorbed, renamed, forgotten. Why has so little of this entered common knowledge? Why, when the achievements of Mesopotamia and Egypt are repeated to every student, is the older European story whispered only in the most specialized of circles? Is it merely the accident of which scholars dug where and when? Or is there something stranger at work? A pattern in how civilizations are remembered and how they are made to be forgotten. Consider how easily a story can be lost. A library burns, a language dies, a people is displaced, and within 3 generations no one alive remembers the names their grandmother spoke at the hearth. Consider how, When one culture overwrites another, the new always tends to claim the inheritance of the old without crediting the source, the way a river takes credit for the rain. The Greeks, for all their genius, did not arrive in an empty land. They settled atop something they themselves half remembered in their oldest myths, in tales of a people called the Pelasgians who had been there before, in legends of giants and sunken kingdoms and goddesses older than Olympus. What if those myths were not invention but memory? What if the strange figurines pulled from the earth in modern Bulgaria and Serbia, the spiral-marked pottery, the burnt mounds called tells that rise like wounds from the plains of the Danube basin, are not curiosities of prehistory, but the surviving fragments of a world that once stretched from the Aegean to the Carpathians, a world that by every reasonable measure deserves to be called a civilization, and yet has been denied the name. And if such a thing could vanish, fully, almost completely from the official memory of an entire continent, what does that say about all the other gaps in the record? What does it say about the confidence with which any one of us speaks the phrase, the dawn of civilization, as though we knew which dawn we meant? The candle of this question has only just been lit. There is much more in the dark. The story of how this lost world began to surface again in modern memory does not begin in a grand expedition or a royal commission. It begins in mud. It begins on the bank of the Danube, just outside Belgrade, in a village whose name had, until then, meant nothing to the wider world. Vinča. The year was 1908, and a Serbian archaeologist named Miloje Vasic was digging into a low mound that local farmers had long known as a place where strange shards came up with the plough. He expected, by the prevailing logic of his time, to find a Roman site. Perhaps a forgotten outpost of the empire, perhaps a cemetery, perhaps the rubble of a frontier village. Roman ruins were the assumed default for almost any anomaly in the soil of southeastern Europe. The deeper history of the region had not yet been imagined. It was, in the academic mind of the early 20th century, simply a blank between the receding glaciers of the Ice Age and the arrival of classical civilization. So Vasic dug expecting Rome. What he found was something else entirely. Beneath a thin Roman layer he encountered another layer, and beneath that another, and another, and another, going down 9 meters into the earth. A stratified record of habitation so deep, so sustained, that it seemed to refuse the calendar of his expectations. There were houses with plastered walls, fragments of finely burnished black pottery, figurines with mask-like faces and incised geometric patterns, hearths and ovens still bearing the soot of meals that had been cooked 7,000 years before he was born. There were no Roman coins in the lower strata. There were no Greek inscriptions. There was nothing that fit the timeline he had been trained to expect. Vasic, by all accounts a careful and conservative man, struggled for years to understand what he was uncovering. He was reluctant to claim too much. The dating methods of the early 20th century were primitive. Radiocarbon analysis would not be invented for another 40 years. He fell back, as many scholars of his era did, on diffusionist explanations. Perhaps these objects were echoes of distant influences from the Aegean or from Anatolia, late copies of older Mediterranean styles. He published his findings, but he published them cautiously, almost apologetically, as though afraid of what they might mean if taken at face value. The truth, when it finally came through the slow, grinding work of carbon dating in the second half of the 20th century. The lower layers of Vinča were not late copies of anything. They were original. They were among the earliest substantial settlements in Europe. The pottery, the figurines, the houses with their plastered walls and orderly arrangements. These things dated back to roughly 5,300 years before the Common Era, and the culture they represented had endured, evolving and expanding for nearly 2,000 years afterward, spreading across what is today Serbia, Romania, Bulgaria, parts of Hungary, parts of Bosnia, parts of North Macedonia, an area larger than many modern European nations. There is something almost vertiginous about standing at such a discovery, even at the distance of a century. Imagine the slow inversion of one's mental map, the realization that the place one had thought of as the periphery had once been a centre, that what had been imagined as a forest of unlettered tribes was in fact dotted with settlements housing hundreds, sometimes thousands of people, that the line of civilization, which had been drawn so confidently from the Tigris to the Nile to the Aegean, must now be redrawn, must be expanded, must be complicated, must perhaps be redrawn entirely. And yet even now, more than 100 years after Vasek first sank his shovel into that mound, how many people have heard the name Vinča? How many history textbooks devote even a paragraph to it? The discovery exists, it is documented, it is studied in specialized circles, but it has never entered the bloodstream of common knowledge the way Troy did, the way Pompeii did, the way Tutankhamun's tomb did when Howard Carter cracked it open in 1922. Why? Part of the answer is, of course, the simple inertia of established narratives. Once a story has been told a certain way long enough, it becomes the default. New evidence does not so much overturn the old story as it gets folded into footnotes, into specialist journals, into corners where only the curious go looking. The dawn of civilization had been claimed by Mesopotamia, and Mesopotamia did not give up the title easily. Diffusionism, the idea that civilization spread outward from a single source, had been the dominant explanatory framework for generations, and it was reluctant to admit that two or more independent centres might have lit their own fires in parallel. But there is another part to the answer, and it is harder to name. There is the question of who tells the story of the past, and from where and why. Vinča lies in the Balkans, a region that has spent much of the modern era at the margins of the great Western academic capitals. Its discoveries were published in Serbian, in German, in French, in journals that did not always reach the libraries of Oxford or Harvard or the Sorbonne. The early 20th century was an age in which the prestige of an archaeological find was often shaped by the language in which it was first announced and the empire from which the announcer came. A Serbian site dug by a Serbian scholar, published in Serbian, simply did not carry the same weight as a discovery announced in English under the patronage of the British Museum. So the layers stayed in the soil and the soil stayed in the margin, even as the picture they revealed grew steadily larger. By the late 20th century, Vinča was understood to be only one node in a vast network. Sites with similar pottery, similar architecture, similar figurines were turning up across the entire Balkan Peninsula and into the Carpathian Basin. Whatever this had been, it had not been a village. It had not been a tribe. It had been, by any honest measure, a civilization without an agreed-upon name, without a known language, without the cooperation of any king to fix it in chronicles, but a civilization nonetheless. And it raises a quiet, persistent question, the kind that does not let go once it has been heard. If something so vast could lie 9 meters beneath a Serbian field and remain unknown for centuries, what else might lie elsewhere, still unread, still unrecognized? How much of the human story is buried not in lost continents or fanciful Atlantises, but simply in the ordinary fields that any farmer's plough might one day catch on? There is a deeper layer still, and in it, scratched into clay, are marks that should not, by every conventional measure, exist. The marks were small, almost trivial at first glance. Little notches and lines and crosses pressed into baked clay, the kind of thing one might dismiss as decoration, as doodling, as the absent-minded scratch of a potter waiting for a kiln to cool. For a long time, that is exactly how they were dismissed. They turned up here and there across the Vinča sites, on figurines, on pots, on small fired tablets, and they were filed away in museum drawers under the loose heading of ornamental motifs. No one in the early decades of the 20th century looked at them and thought of writing. Then came the discovery at Tărtăria. The village of Tărtăria lies in western Romania, in the rolling country of Transylvania, not far from the Mureș River. In 1961, a Romanian archaeologist named Nicolae Vlasa was excavating a small mound there when he uncovered a pit containing the burnt and broken bones of an adult human. 26 clay figurines, 2 stone bracelets, a shell pendant, and 3 small clay tablets, each no larger than a child's palm. 2 of the tablets were rectangular and pierced with a hole, as if meant to be worn or hung. The third was round, divided into quadrants by incised lines, and each quadrant was filled with marks. The marks were not random. They were arranged in deliberate groupings. They resembled, in unsettling ways, the early proto-writing of Mesopotamia, the kind of pictographic notation from which Sumerian cuneiform would eventually evolve. Some of the symbols looked almost identical to signs used at Uruk, the great early city of southern Iraq, where the world's first undisputed writing system had taken shape. There was, however, a problem. The Tărtăria tablets, when their context was carefully dated, appeared to be older than the Sumerian signs they resembled, older by centuries, possibly by as much as 1,000 years. This was not supposed to be possible. The accepted story of the origin of writing held, and largely still holds, that it began in Mesopotamia, in the cities of Sumer, around 3,200 years before the Common Era, emerging there for the first time as a tool for accounting, for tracking grain and livestock and labour in the bureaucracies of the world's earliest urban states. From Sumer, writing was thought to have radiated outward, slowly transforming as it travelled. To find writing-like symbols in the European Balkans dating to perhaps 5,300 or even 5,500 years before the Common Era was to invert the entire developmental sequence. It was to suggest that something had been happening on the Danube before Sumer was Sumer. The reaction, predictably, was disagreement, a long and at times bitter scholarly disagreement that has not been settled even now. Some researchers, looking at the totality of the Vinča and Tărtăria signs, and there are now over 1,000 documented examples drawn from sites across the Balkans, argued that what was being witnessed was indeed an independent system of proto-writing, perhaps the earliest in the world. They pointed to the consistency of the symbols across vast distances and centuries. Certain signs reappeared again and again on different objects, in different sites, hundreds of kilometres apart. This was not the random doodling of bored potters. This was a shared code. Others, more conservative, pushed back. They argued that the marks lacked the linear sequencing of true writing, that there was no evidence the signs encoded spoken language, that what was being seen was perhaps a system of magical or religious symbols. Meaningful, certainly, but not writing in the strict sense. The dispute became, and remains, one of the great quiet quarrels of European archaeology. To call the Vinča signs writing is to rewrite the history of writing itself. To deny them that status is to leave unanswered the question of what, exactly, those careful, repeated, deliberate marks were meant to do. There is a kind of silence that gathers around this question, a silence that is itself revealing. Consider what it would mean if the more daring interpretation turned out to be correct. It would mean that an unknown people, in a region long dismissed as peripheral to the great currents of civilization, developed a method of recording, of fixing thought or names or accounts or sacred formulas, into clay more than 5,000 years before the Common Era. It would mean that the conventional flow of civilization, from Mesopotamia outward to the lesser cousins, would have to be reversed or at least made far more complicated. It would mean that somewhere in those incised marks lies perhaps the oldest written record of any human language ever found, and that record is at present completely unread, because no one knows what language the people of old Europe spoke. There are no surviving descendants of it that can be confidently identified. There are no bilingual inscriptions, no Rosetta Stones, no later texts that quote the older words. Whatever those signs encoded, the key has been lost. Even if every researcher in the world tomorrow agreed that the Vinca marks constituted true writing, they would still face a wall of silence. The marks would be visible but not legible, present but mute. There is something deeply strange about that condition. To stand before a row of symbols knowing that someone 6,000 or 7,000 years ago set them down with intention, that they meant something, that they were worth carrying, worth firing into clay, worth burying with the dead, and to be unable to recover even a single word. It is the literacy of ghosts. The ink is still on the page, but the page belongs to no language we remember. And the questions multiply. Why, if such a system existed, did it not survive the way Sumerian cuneiform did? Why did it leave no daughter scripts, no clear lineage into the alphabets of the later Mediterranean? Did it die with the civilization that produced it, when that civilization itself was unmade? Or did fragments of it survive, transmuted in symbols that now appear in folk embroidery, in the borders of woven cloths, in the carvings on village houses across Romania and Serbia and Bulgaria, symbols whose ancient meanings have been forgotten but whose shapes have been faithfully copied by generation after generation, like a song hummed by people who no longer remember the words. To even ask such things is to feel the ground tilt slightly. It is to suspect that the history of writing, and therefore the history of how human beings began to record themselves in time, may be older, stranger, and more fragmentary than the textbooks have ever been willing to admit. And it leads inevitably to another question, larger still. Because writing does not arise in vacant fields. Writing arises among gatherings of people, in places where there is something worth recording and someone to record it for. Where, then, were the cities of these makers of marks? And why, when they are at last described, do they look like nothing the world has agreed to expect? For a long time, the assumption held that true cities, places of many thousands, organized in streets and quarters, sustained by surrounding farms, were a Mesopotamian invention. Uruk, with its tens of thousands of inhabitants in the 4th millennium before the Common Era, was held up as the prototype, the first true urban experiment, the cradle in which the very idea of a city was supposed to have been born. Anything earlier, anywhere else, was assumed to be on a smaller scale. Villages, hamlets, clustered farmsteads, settlements that might rise to a few hundred souls, but never to the density and complexity of an actual city. Then aerial photographs began to come back from the broad plains north of the Black Sea, in what is now Ukraine and Moldova and northeastern Romania, and what they showed disturbed the established picture profoundly. There were rings, vast concentric rings of burned earth, visible from the air as faint discolorations in the soil, sometimes traced more clearly by the differing growth of crops above them. The rings enclosed enormous areas, hundreds of acres in some cases, and within them the ghosts of dwellings could be made out. Hundreds, sometimes thousands of them arranged in radial patterns, in ordered streets, in clusters that bore every hallmark of careful planning. The largest of these settlements, near the modern Ukrainian village of Talianki, covered an area of nearly 340 hectares. Estimates of population based on the density of houses range from 10,000 to as high as 15,000 inhabitants, possibly more. This was the Cucuteni-Trypillia culture, named for the two villages, one in Romania, one in Ukraine, where its remains had first been recognized in the late 19th century. By the time the aerial surveys of the latter 20th century revealed the true scale of its mega-settlements, dating had already placed its existence between roughly 5,200 and 2,800 years before the Common Era, which is to say, at the very moment, or even slightly before, Sumer was developing its first cities. The people of the Cucuteni-Trypillia world were already living in settlements of comparable, sometimes greater size, on the European steppe. And yet to call these places cities in the Mesopotamian sense feels, on closer inspection, almost wrong. They had the population, they had the planning, they had the density, but they were missing things that every Mesopotamian city possessed. There were no palaces. No structure within any Cucuteni-Trypillia settlement has ever been identified as a clear seat of royal or aristocratic power. The houses, while varying somewhat in size, do not show the kind of dramatic stratification one finds in Uruk or in the early dynastic cities of the Tigris and Euphrates, where great elite compounds tower over the dwellings of the common population. The Cucuteni-Trypillia houses are remarkably uniform. They are, by the standards of any city anywhere in the ancient world, almost suspiciously equal. There were no grand temples in the Mesopotamian sense, no ziggurats, no monumental shrines designed to overawe a populace and mark the dwelling place of a god-king's deity. There are buildings that scholars have tentatively interpreted as ritual or communal in function, but they're modest in scale, integrated into the residential fabric, not separated and elevated as the temples of Sumer were. There were, perhaps most remarkably, no fortifications. Cities of 15,000 people on an open plain surrounded by other peoples and other cultures, and yet without walls, without ditches, without the defensive architecture that would, within just a few centuries, become the absolute hallmark of any settled population, large enough to be worth raiding. The houses faced inward toward shared central spaces. The arrangement suggests gathering, not guarding. And there were astonishingly few weapons. Excavations at Cucuteni-Trypillia sites turn up enormous quantities of pottery, some of it among the most exquisite ever produced in prehistoric Europe, painted with spirals and meanders and stylized animal forms in red and black and white, and an abundance of figurines and tools for grinding and weaving and farming, and ovens and storage vessels. Weapons specifically designed for warfare against other humans are conspicuously rare. There are flint blades and arrowheads, but in proportions consistent with hunting, not standing armies. There are no mass graves. There are no citywide burn layers from external assault. The settlements appear to have lived in long peace. How is this possible? How does a population of 15,000 organize itself for centuries without the apparatus that every history textbook insists is required? Without kings, without standing soldiers, without enforced hierarchies, without the threat of organized violence. The conventional model of the rise of urbanism almost demands these features. Cities, the model says, arise because surplus produces inequality. Inequality produces conflict. Conflict produces the need for centralized authority and defense, and from that need emerge kings and priests and walls. The Cucuteni-Trypillia megasettlements seem to have skipped some essential step in that argument, or perhaps to refute the argument altogether. Some researchers have suggested that what is being seen here is a different model of urbanism entirely, a model in which large populations cooperated through diffuse, possibly kin-based, possibly council-based forms of governance, a model in which religious or ritual cohesion replaced the coercive cohesion of later states, a model that, for whatever reason, did not survive into the historical record, perhaps because it was overwritten by the more aggressive, More centralized policies that followed, perhaps because the very absence of monumental architecture and royal inscriptions left it with no voice loud enough to reach across millennia. And yet, for all this strangeness, the Cucuteni-Trypillia settlements were not static. They were not frozen utopias. They had a peculiar habit, a habit that haunts every researcher who studies them. Every 60 to 80 years, with a regularity that is almost ritualistic, each great settlement was burned to the ground, not destroyed in war, not destroyed by accident, burned deliberately by its own inhabitants in what appears to have been a planned and systematic incineration. Houses were filled with combustible materials. Pots and figurines were sometimes left inside, undamaged, as if to be consumed alongside the dwellings, and then the whole settlement was set alight and abandoned. Sometimes, after a generation or two had passed, a new settlement was raised, often nearby, sometimes directly atop the ashes of the old. The cycle would begin again, build, dwell, burn, rebuild, for nearly 2,500 years. Why? What did it mean to them? What was being purified? What was being released? What was being concluded by these vast and deliberate fires? And what kind of society possesses the social cohesion, the patience and the conviction to commit over and over again to the destruction of its own cities, and then to carry the children and the seed grain a few hills further on and begin again? There are no inscriptions to answer, only ash, and the ash, when patiently sifted, has begun in recent decades to whisper of more. There is one figure more than any other, whose name has become entangled with the mystery of these vanished cities, and whose work polarized the field of archaeology so deeply that the echoes of the argument have not yet faded. Maria Gimbutas, a Lithuanian-born archaeologist who fled the Soviet occupation of her homeland during the Second World War, made her way to the United States, and rose through the academic ranks at Harvard and then at the University of California to become one of the most prominent and most controversial interpreters of European prehistory in the 20th century. Gimbutas had spent decades excavating Neolithic sites across southeastern Europe. She had handled, by the end of her career, more of the figurines, the pottery, the symbolic objects of the Vinča and Cucuteni-Trypillia and related cultures than perhaps any other scholar of her generation. And she had begun, slowly at first and then with growing conviction, to argue something that would brand her, in the eyes of many of her colleagues, as a heretic. The civilization of old Europe, she proposed, had not merely lacked kings and walls and armies. It had been in its essential character a society organized around the feminine, a society in which the divine was conceived primarily as a goddess, or a constellation of goddesses, rather than as a sky father with a thunderbolt in his hand. A society that traced descent, perhaps, through the maternal line. A society in which women held social authority commensurate with men, in which the rhythms of agriculture and birth and the moon were the central organizing metaphors of the spiritual life. She called this world matristic, careful to avoid the loaded term matriarchy, with its implications of female domination mirroring male. And she argued that it had endured for thousands of years across the Balkans and beyond, until it was overrun, beginning around 4,400 years before the Common Era, by waves of patriarchal, hierarchical, horse-riding warrior peoples coming in from the east. Her evidence was the figurines, the thousands upon thousands of small clay female figures that come up from the soil of every major old European site. Standing women, seated women, pregnant women, women with elaborate headdresses, with masked faces, with markings on their thighs and breasts that seem to encode some now-lost grammar of the sacred. There are male figurines too, but they are vastly outnumbered by the female ones. And the male figures, when they appear, are often subordinate in size, posture and prominence. The temples where temples can be identified contain altars on which female figures stand. The painted symbols on the pottery, the spirals, the meanders, the chevrons, the stylized birds and snakes and bees, Gimbutas read as a coherent symbolic language of the goddess, traceable across millennia. She was by any honest measure doing something audacious. She was reading prehistoric symbols as a system, attempting to recover not only what the people of old Europe made, but what they thought, what they worshipped, how they understood the world. And the academic reaction was sharp. Her critics, and they were many and they were prominent, accused her of overinterpretation. They said she was reading her own beliefs into the artifacts. They pointed out correctly that no one can be certain what a figurine meant to the person who made it, that the same object might have served as a child's toy, a ritual offering, a domestic charm, an effigy of an ancestor, or any combination of these. They argued that the leap from many female figurines to a goddess-centered religion was a leap unsupported by the kind of explicit textual evidence that, in other cultures, allows researchers to make such claims with confidence. The people of old Europe, after all, had left no scriptures, no hymns, no theological treatises. To declare them worshippers of a goddess was, in the eyes of her critics, to dress prehistoric silence in modern clothes. Some of the criticism, no doubt, was fair. Gimbutas at times wrote with a confidence that outran her evidence. Her later books, in particular, drew bold pictures of old European spiritual life that were difficult to defend on the level of any single artifact. There is a long and honourable tradition in archaeology of caution, of refusing to say more than the bones and the pots can be made to bear, and Gimbutas sometimes broke with that tradition. But other criticism, in retrospect, seems to have been driven by something less methodological and more visceral. To suggest that an entire continent had once been organised around the feminine was, for many scholars in the second half of the 20th century, simply too far a departure from the deep narrative of Western civilization as a male-dominated trajectory. The dismissal of Gimbutas was sometimes argued in technical terms, but often delivered with a heat that suggested the technical was not all that was at stake. Her work was relegated, in many academic circles, to the shelf reserved for the inspirational rather than the rigorous. She became, particularly after her death in 1994, a figure more often cited by spiritual seekers and feminist authors than by her fellow archaeologists. And yet in the decades since, much of what was once considered her wildest claim has been quietly partially vindicated. The Kurgan hypothesis, her larger argument that the Indo-European languages and the patriarchal cultures associated with them spread from a homeland in the steppes north of the Black Sea, displacing or absorbing the older cultures of old Europe, has been substantially supported by ancient DNA research over the past 15 years. The genetic record now shows, with increasing clarity, exactly the kind of demographic upheaval she predicted. A massive influx of Yamnaya-related ancestry into Europe beginning around 4,500 years before the Common Era, replacing in many regions a significant portion of the previous gene pool. The mechanism, was it conquest? Was it migration? Was it some combination? Remains debated, but the fact of it does not. If Gimbutas was right about the disruption, the question of what was disrupted becomes more pressing rather than less. If she was correct that an older civilization was overwritten, the matter of how that older civilization understood itself, what it believed, how it organized its inner life, ceases to be merely speculative. It becomes, in a sense, the central question. What was lost when the cities of old Europe burned for the last time and were not rebuilt? What kind of mind had filled those rooms? What kind of memory had walked those streets? Perhaps the figurines do not tell as clear a story as Gimbutas wished them to. Perhaps her reading was, in places, overconfident. But the alternative, to dismiss them entirely, To treat them as decorative trinkets without symbolic weight feels like its own kind of overconfidence. They were made in numbers too great to be incidental. They were cared for, broken, buried, sometimes ritually deposited. Whatever they were, they mattered to the hands that shaped them. And before those hands set down their last figurine and walked away from the burning towns, those same hands had already been doing something else. Something equally astonishing. Something that turned the very earth itself into a record of unprecedented skill. Beneath the soil of a small Bulgarian town, beside an ancient lagoon long since silted into farmland, lay the proof of it, and it would not surface until 1972. A backhoe operator named Raicho Marinov was the one who first turned it up. He was working on the construction of a cable factory just outside the Bulgarian city of Varna on the Black Sea coast in October of 1972. The ground there was flat, unremarkable, the kind of low coastal land that had once been a shallow lagoon and was now industrial fringe. He was clearing a trench when his bucket struck something that glittered. He bent down, brushed away the soil, and held in his hand a small, perfectly worked piece of gold, then another and another. He did the right thing. He stopped the machine, gathered what he could into an old shoebox, and brought the find to the local archaeologists. What followed was one of the most extraordinary excavations of the 20th century, and one of the least known to the wider public. What Marinov had stumbled into was a necropolis, a burial ground, and the burial ground, as the work of the next several years revealed, dated to a period between roughly 4,600 and 4,200 years before the Common Era, which is to say, it was older than the pyramids of Egypt by 1,000 years. It was older than the first dynasty of any Mesopotamian city by several centuries. It belonged to a phase of European prehistory that, before this discovery, had not been imagined as capable of producing what was found within it. In the end, the Varna necropolis would yield more than 300 graves. Some were modest, containing little more than a body and a few pots. Others were richer, with shell ornaments and copper tools. And then there were the ones that changed everything. There were graves, a small number of them, in which the dead had been laid to rest beneath an astonishing weight of gold. Bracelets, diadems, pectoral plates, beads in their thousands, pendants, sceptres, sheets of beaten gold that had been wrapped around now vanished wooden objects, leaving only their gilded skins behind. The grave designated as number 43 alone contained nearly 1.5 kilograms of gold, distributed across more than 900 separate objects, accompanying the body of a man who had been buried with what appeared to be a long ceremonial sceptre, and the markers of an authority no one had previously suspected this period or this place could produce. Altogether, the necropolis yielded over 6 kilograms of worked gold, more than 3,000 individual gold objects. The total exceeded, at the time of its excavation, the combined weight of all known prehistoric gold from every other site on Earth. This was, and is, the oldest substantial collection of worked gold ever found anywhere in the world. The implications were staggering, and they remain so. To work gold at the level of refinement seen at Varna, to extract it, melt it, hammer it, cast it, perforate it, polish it, requires a chain of technological capabilities that most accounts of prehistoric Europe had not been willing to grant to its inhabitants. It requires an understanding of metallurgy. It requires furnaces capable of reaching the necessary temperatures. It requires tools of stone and copper precise enough to shape the soft metal without tearing it. And it requires, perhaps, most tellingly, a society in which such labour and such material can be concentrated, in which someone is producing the surplus that allows others to spend their days at the smelting hearth and the workbench, and in which someone is dying with enough authority that they are buried beneath a glittering hoard rather than simply laid in the earth in a shroud. And the gold was not the only metal. Varna and the related settlements of the Balkan Carpathian metallurgical province. For it has come to be recognized that this was a province, a network of mines and smelters and craftspeople stretching across what is now Bulgaria, Serbia, and beyond, were producing copper at a scale and to a standard that predates the great metallurgical traditions of Mesopotamia. Copper axes, copper chisels, copper awls, copper ornaments. The deposits at Ibuna in Bulgaria, mined as early as the 5th millennium before the Common Era, are among the oldest worked copper mines anywhere on Earth. The galleries cut into the rock there, narrow and dark and dangerous, were the workplaces of miners whose names will never be known and whose civilization left no chronicle to remember them by. What this means, taken together, is a quiet inversion of the standard story of how human technology developed. The conventional narrative places the dawn of metallurgy in the ancient Near East and traces its spread westward into Europe. The Varnafind and the Balkan mining sites do not entirely overturn that picture, but they complicate it severely. They suggest that southeastern Europe was at the very least a parallel centre of metallurgical innovation, possibly an independent one. They suggest that the people of old Europe were not the recipients of distant influence, but, in this domain, perhaps the originators. They were among the first human beings on the planet to look at a green-blue rock and know that fire could pull metal out of it. Among the first to look at a pale yellow stream of melted material and pour it into a shape they had imagined. What did such knowledge mean to them? It is one of the achingly silent questions. The transformation of stone into metal must have appeared as something close to magic to those who first achieved it. A true alchemy, the violation of the apparent natures of things, the coaxing of one substance out of another by means of heat and patience and ritual. Across many later cultures, smiths were figures of awe and sometimes of fear set apart from ordinary society, regarded as workers in a sacred and dangerous craft. There is no reason to assume the smiths of Varna and Ibuna were regarded any less seriously by the people they served, and yet, when one stands in front of the Varna gold today, much of it preserved in the museum in that same Bulgarian city, displayed in dim cases that allow the soft yellow of the metal to glow against the velvet, one cannot help but feel a particular weight of silence around it. There are no inscriptions, there are no names. The man buried in grave 43 with all his ornaments and his sceptre is unknown. He may have been a chief, a priest, a metallurgist, an honoured elder, a figure whose role does not fit any later category. He went into the earth wrapped in glory and came out of it 6,000 years later, still wrapped in glory but not in identity. The glow is intact, the story is gone. The question this raises is one of the most haunting in all of prehistoric studies. What does it mean for a civilization to leave behind so much wealth, so much skill, so much demonstrable evidence of complex social organization, and to leave behind, with all of it, no readable account of who they were or what they understood themselves to be doing? Is this a failure of preservation? Is it the result of media that have not survived? Wood, hide, plant fibre, things that rot in the soil while gold and clay endure? Or is it that the people of old Europe simply did not, for whatever reason, write themselves down in the way later civilizations did? Perhaps the answer lies in what came next. Because every great burial ground at Varna, every flourishing settlement at Cucuteni, every workshop at Vinča eventually came to an end. Some ended quietly, some ended in flame. And the question of why the cities burned over and over again by their own people, with what seems to have been ceremonial intent, leads into a darker chamber of this long story. The fires at the Cucuteni-Trypillia settlements were not careless fires. They were not the work of an enemy come to destroy. They were not, by any evidence, the result of accidents that swept through wooden houses thatched too closely together. The patterns left in the soil tell a different story, and the story is one that researchers have struggled for decades to make sense of. The houses had been prepared. That much is clear from the careful excavation of dozens of these burned structures across Ukraine, Moldova, and Romania. Before the fires were set, certain things were done. Combustible material, straw, brushwood, sometimes additional timber, was added to the dwellings. Not to all of them, perhaps, but to many. Inside the houses, ordinary objects were left in their places. Pots still on shelves, grinding stones still on the floor. Even, in some cases, figurines still standing on their small clay pedestals near the hearth. The objects were not removed. They were not buried elsewhere for safekeeping. They were left to burn with the building. And then the fires were set, and they were set with such intensity that the clay walls of the houses themselves vitrified. The temperatures reached in the burning of these settlements were extraordinarily high. High enough to fuse the daub of the walls into a glassy, ceramic-like substance, the kind of finish a kiln produces deliberately. To achieve such heat in the open, in a structure designed to be lived in rather than fired, requires a deliberate effort. It requires that the inhabitants want the fire to burn at that intensity. They were not merely abandoning their houses. They were in some sense firing them, the way a potter fires a vessel. And then, after the burning, in the great majority of cases, the settlement was not rebuilt on the same spot. The community moved. A few kilometers away, sometimes a day's walk, a new ring of houses was raised, and within 60 or 80 years the new settlement too would be filled with its own combustibles, set alight, and walked away from. This pattern continued for 2,500 years. Why? The question has produced theories, and the theories illuminate as much by what they reveal about modern assumptions as by what they propose about ancient minds. One school of thought, the most prosaic, has suggested that the burnings were practical, a kind of agricultural reset. The land around a long-inhabited settlement, the argument runs, would have become exhausted after several generations of intensive farming and grazing. Fields would yield less. Wood for fuel would grow scarce as the surrounding forest thinned. Pests, disease, the accumulation of waste in a dense settlement would all gradually make a place less habitable. To burn the old town and move on, in this reading, was simply rational management, a way of resetting the relationship between a community and its landscape, of returning a depleted patch of earth to fallow and starting again on fresh ground. There is something to this. The cycle does correspond very roughly to the time frame in which the carrying capacity of an area of land could plausibly be strained by a settlement of several thousand people farming with the tools available, and the fact that the patterns of relocation tend to keep within a recognizable territory. Daughter settlements rising in the same general region as their parents suggests something like rotational stewardship of a familiar landscape. But the practical theory does not quite account for everything. It does not explain the intensity of the burning, the way the fires were stoked to vitrification temperatures rather than simply allowed to consume the wood and thatch. It does not explain the leaving of valuable objects inside, pots, tools, sometimes ornaments, that any rational departing population might have been expected to carry to their new home. It does not, most of all, explain the cultural persistence of the practice across so many centuries and across so wide a region. Practical decisions, made independently, do not usually produce a uniform ritual signature. Something more was being said. A second school has suggested ritual cleansing, that the burnings were periodic acts of religious renewal, a kind of community-wide funeral for the dwelling place itself. There are echoes of this in many later cultures, where the abandonment of a house upon a death, or the ritual destruction of objects belonging to the deceased, has been documented. To extend such a logic to an entire settlement is a leap, but it is not an absurd one. perhaps every 2 or 3 generations. When a critical number of those who had founded a settlement had died, the place itself was understood to have completed its life cycle and was ceremonially released, sent to whatever afterworld the people of old Europe imagined for the things they had loved and used. A third theory, more recent and more unsettling, has proposed that the burnings may have been responses to crisis, to outbreaks of disease perhaps. The dense Cucuteni-Trypillia mega-settlements, with their thousands of inhabitants packed into their concentric rings of houses, would have been ideal incubators for the kinds of contagions that thrive in close quarters. Recent ancient DNA research has identified the presence of plague pathogens, early forms of Yersinia pestis, in human remains from across Eurasia in the 4th millennium before the Common Era. It is now seriously discussed among researchers that some of the great old European settlements may have been periodically devastated by epidemic disease, and that the mass burnings may have been at least in part public health responses on a civilizational scale, a way of cleansing a contaminated place, of breaking the chain of infection by reducing the diseased houses and their contents to ash. This third theory, if it holds, casts a long shadow. Because if the people of old Europe had learned, through hard and bitter experience, that the only way to break a plague was to burn the cities to the ground and walk away, then the elegant rhythm of their settlements, build, dwell, burn, rebuild, takes on a quieter, more sorrowful note. It would mean their genius for cooperation and their famous lack of fortifications and weapons did not preserve them from every danger. It would mean they was doing what they could in the face of an invisible enemy that no wall could keep out, and it would suggest perhaps that something in this long centuries-spanning struggle eventually broke them, that when the final settlements of the Cucuteni-Trypillia world were burned and not rebuilt, around 28 or 2700 years before the Common Era, it was not necessarily the swords of horsemen alone that had made the rebuilding impossible. Whatever the cause, the cycle did finally end. The last great burnings happened, the last walls vitrified. The people who had carried the seed grain and the figurines and the painted pots from one ring of houses to the next, generation after generation, did not this time raise a new ring. They scattered. They blended into other populations. Their distinctive pottery faded. Their figurines stopped being made. Whatever cosmology had sustained the long ritual of incineration and renewal lost its grip on the imagination of their descendants, or its grip was broken by something coming from outside. And something was, in fact, coming from outside. From the east, from the wide grasslands beyond the Don, beyond the Volga, something that moved at a speed no settled people had ever encountered before. Something that arrived not on foot, but on the back of a creature that had only recently been tamed, and whose 4-footed thunder would, in the end, change the language and the gods of an entire continent. The horse changes everything. Not at first, not all at once, but gradually, in a series of innovations spread across centuries on the open steppe north of the Black Sea, until at last the combination of a domesticated animal, a wheeled vehicle, and a particular kind of social organization came together in a way that the settled farming peoples of Europe had no precedent for and no defense against. The grasslands stretched in those millennia in a vast unbroken corridor from the Carpathian foothills eastward, across what is now southern Russia and Ukraine, beyond the Caspian Sea, into the deserts and uplands of Central Asia. It was a sea of grass, open, treeless, swept by wind, populated by herds of wild horses, and the people who had begun, somewhere around the 4th millennium before the Common Era, to follow them, to manage them, and finally to ride them. The exact moment of the first riding is contested, as such moments always are. Bones of horses appear in human context in the steppe long before the first clear evidence of riding. They're present at hunting and pastoral sites going back many thousands of years, But the transformation from prey to mount, from companion of the table to extension of the human body, seems to have crystallized somewhere in the broad zone north of the Black Sea sometime between 4,500 and 3,500 years before the Common Era. By the time the next great innovation arrived, the wheel and the cart that could be drawn by oxen and later by horses, the steppe had become something the world had never seen before. A region in which mobility was not the exception but the norm, in which a family's wealth could be moved with it, in which the dead were buried beneath earthen mounds, the kurgans raised at the places where their journeys had paused. It was Maria Gimbutas, again, who first proposed in detail that this kurgan culture, named for those burial mounds, was the source of the Indo-European languages and of the great cultural displacement that ended Old Europe. Her hypothesis, when she first proposed it in the 1950s and 60s, was treated by many of her colleagues as speculative and overreaching. The idea that a single people, identified by burial customs and pottery styles in a remote corner of the steppe, could have spread across most of Europe and into Iran and India, carrying their language and their gods with them, struck many scholars as a romantic notion better suited to the 19th century than the 20th. The Indo-European homeland, the alternative view held, was probably to be found in Anatolia, and the spread of the languages was probably to be associated with the slow, peaceful diffusion of farming westward across Europe in the 7th and 6th millennia. For decades, the two hypotheses argued past each other. Then, beginning around 2015, a new kind of evidence began to settle the question, or at least to settle one of its main coordinates. The evidence came from ancient DNA. Researchers in laboratories in Boston, in Copenhagen, in Jena and Leipzig began extracting genetic material from prehistoric bones across Europe and the steppe. They sequenced hundreds of skeletons and then thousands, and the pattern that emerged was unambiguous. Around 4,500 years before the Common Era, a population from the western steppe, the people now called the Yamnaya, after the type of pit grave burials they made, began to expand westward into Europe in such numbers that within a few centuries their genetic signature came to dominate large portions of the continent's gene pool. In some regions, particularly in Central and Northern Europe, the existing populations were almost entirely replaced. In others, particularly in the south, the steppe ancestry was layered over older Neolithic and hunter-gatherer ancestries in different proportions, but the layering was real and substantial in nearly every case. This was not, the genetic evidence suggested, a slow seepage of small numbers across generations. This was a demographic event of extraordinary scale, compressed into a relatively short time window, and accompanied by what looks, in the bones, like a sex-biased pattern of replacement. The Y chromosome lineages, the marker carried only by males, show particularly dramatic turnover during this period. In some areas, the male lines that had dominated for thousands of years are almost entirely supplanted by new male lines from the steppe. The female mitochondrial lineages, while also shifting, do not show the same severity of replacement. The pattern is consistent, though not the only possible explanation, with a scenario in which incoming groups of male-led, mobile, militarized populations took as partners the women of the local settled populations, while their male competitors largely did not survive to reproduce. There are gentler readings of this evidence, and harsher ones, and the truth is almost certainly varied across regions and centuries. But the broad fact of demographic disruption is no longer in dispute. Whatever the precise mechanisms, whether through coordinated raids, through gradual infiltration, through the displacement of farming populations weakened by the very plague pathogens we've already met, through alliances and absorptions that played out across many generations, the world that came out the other side of this transition was no longer the world of old Europe. The figurines stopped being made. The painted pottery, with its long traditions of spiraling and geometric symbolism, gave way to coarser styles, often with cord-impressed decoration that has given the new culture one of its archaeological names, the corded ware. The mega-settlements emptied. New kinds of burials appeared. Single individuals beneath mounds, often with weapons, often with ornaments of a kind designed to mark personal status rather than communal participation. A new social grammar had arrived. The languages that came with these incoming populations were, by the best linguistic reconstructions, ancestral forms of what would eventually become Greek, Latin, the Celtic and Germanic and Slavic and Baltic and Iranian and Indo-Aryan tongues. Languages of patriarchal kinship, with words for father, brother, paternal uncle, that match across all the daughter branches in ways that suggest a deeply rooted social form. Languages with words for the wheel, the yoke, the wagon, the horse, words that match across the daughter branches because they describe technologies the speakers had already mastered before they began to scatter. Languages whose oldest reconstructed gods were sky gods, thunder gods, riders, masters of horses and of war. What had been swept away was not necessarily peaceful. To call old Europe peaceful in any modern sense would be to project on it a virtue it could not have known itself to possess. But it had been built around different organizing principles, and those principles, whatever they had been, did not survive the encounter with the steppe. A continent had changed languages, a continent had changed gods, a continent had changed, in significant measure, its very genome. And yet, and here is one of the strangest aspects of the whole long story, the older world did not entirely vanish. It went underground. It survived in fragments, in substrata, in names that no later speaker could quite explain. And before there was any Greece to speak of, before there was any Rome, before there was any of what is now called the Western tradition, the layers had begun to compress. The older voices had begun to whisper from beneath, and the question of how much had truly been lost became a question that no later civilization has ever quite been able to answer. But before that compression could even begin, before the steppe peoples had finished their long arrival, something else may have already struck the older world, something not made by human hands at all, something that came, depending on which researchers one consults, in the form of rising water, water that drowned shorelines, swallowed villages, and left behind, perhaps, the very memory of a great flood that would echo through the myths of every culture that lived to remember it. The Black Sea, as it appears on any modern map, is an inland sea connected to the Mediterranean through the narrow channel of the Bosporus and the Dardanelles. It is large, deep, and saline. Its waters teem with the kind of life one expects of a sea, though oddly stratified, with an oxygen-rich surface layer and a vast, lifeless, sulfide-poisoned depth below, a quirk of its geography that has preserved, in its sunless lower waters, ships and timbers from antiquity in a state of remarkable completeness. But the Black Sea has not always looked the way it looks now. Sometime in the relatively recent geological past, recent enough that human beings were already farming the lands around it, building villages, raising children, telling stories at hearths, the sea was something else. It was a freshwater lake, and it was significantly smaller, with a shoreline far below where the modern shoreline now lies. In 1996, two American marine geologists, William Ryan and Walter Pittman, published a paper, and 3 years later a book, that proposed something so dramatic that it has been argued over ever since. They proposed that this freshwater lake had been transformed into the modern Black Sea by a sudden catastrophic inundation, a moment in which the rising waters of the post-glacial Mediterranean finally breached the natural dam at the Bosporus and poured with terrible force and astonishing speed into the lower-lying lake basin. They calculated from the volumes of water and the slope of the channel that this inflow would have been roughly 200 times the flow of Niagara Falls, sustained for months or years. They estimated that the lake's level would have risen by a metre or more per day at the height of the event, and that the shoreline would have advanced inland in some places by as much as a kilometre in a single day. They placed the event around 5,600 to 5,500 years before the Common Era, within the very period in which the cultures of old Europe were taking their early shape on the surrounding lands. The reaction in the scientific community was predictably divided. Some marine geologists argued that the sediment record on the seafloor supported the catastrophic interpretation. There were, in their reading, abrupt transitions in the kinds of microscopic organisms preserved in the seabed mud, suggesting a sudden change from freshwater to saline conditions. Others, examining the same and other evidence, argued that the change had been more gradual, that fluctuations in the level of the Black Sea had occurred multiple times across the Holocene, and that there might never have been a single dramatic event of the kind Ryan and Pittman proposed. The debate is not, even now, settled. Different teams of researchers, working with different cores from different parts of the seabed, continue to publish papers that pull in different directions. But what is striking, beyond the scientific question itself, is what the Ryan and Pittman hypothesis stirred up in the broader imagination. Because the rough date of their proposed flood and the rough geography lined up with something almost unbearably suggestive. The Black Sea region was bordered, on its southern and western coasts, by lands that would be remembered in later mythology as places of vanished kingdoms and great deluges. The flood narratives of Mesopotamia, the story of Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the older Sumerian story of Ziusudra, the still older tablets that fragment into pieces of an even more ancient telling, speak of a world drowned by waters sent by the gods. The Hebrew Bible, drawing in part on these older Mesopotamian sources, gives the world the story of Noah, in which a single family and a cargo of animals survive an inundation that wipes humanity from the earth. The Greek myths preserve the story of Deucalion and Pyrrha, who alone survived a great flood sent by Zeus to end the Age of Bronze. Variants of the flood narrative are found, in fact, across the mythologies of an extraordinary number of peoples, from the Andes to India to the islands of the Pacific. The very ubiquity of the story has long been one of the small, persistent puzzles of comparative mythology. Was it a coincidence? Every people in a flood-prone world inventing similar tales? Was it a metaphor, a universal psychological figure for crisis and rebirth? Or was it somewhere at its roots a memory? And if it was a memory, what was it a memory of? The Ryan and Pittman hypothesis, even in its most cautious form, suggested that here, on the shores of what was then a freshwater lake, lived populations of farmers and fishers whose villages would have been suddenly submerged as the waters rose. People whose entire way of life, built around a particular shoreline, particular fishing grounds, particular freshwater wetlands, would have been transformed within months. Some would have fled inland, carrying with them whatever they could carry. Some, presumably, would not have made it. And the survivors, scattering across the landscape, would have carried with them the story of what had happened to their world. There is, beneath the modern Black Sea, the possibility of villages, not myth, actual archaeological remains preserved by the same anoxic conditions that have so well preserved later shipwrecks. In the early 2000s, the explorer Robert Ballard, famous for finding the wreck of the Titanic, conducted underwater surveys off the coast of Turkey and reported the discovery of what appeared to be wooden structures, possibly the timbers of houses, at depth suggesting they had been submerged thousands of years earlier. The findings were preliminary, and questions remain about whether the structures are indeed from a pre-flood human occupation or whether they have other explanations. But the very possibility that there may be drowned settlements lying preserved in the cold dark of the Black Sea floor holds the imagination as few possibilities can. Whether or not the great inundation happened in the dramatic form Ryan and Pittman described, the broader principle their work raised is one that haunts every consideration of prehistoric civilization. Sea levels have risen significantly since the end of the last ice age, by more than 100 meters in some calculations. Vast areas of the world's continental shelves, once dry land, are now underwater. Whatever human beings did on those lands, whatever villages they built, whatever shrines they raised, whatever signs they scratched into rocks now 10 or 20 or 50 meters beneath the waves, much of it is unrecoverable in any practical sense. The archaeological record of prehistoric humanity, the official one, is largely a record of what survived above water. What was lost beneath water is not in dispute. It is simply, by definition, missing. What does it mean to write the history of a species when so much of its early evidence may be drowned? What does it mean for an entire civilization, like that of old Europe, to be partially traced from the high ground that survived, while perhaps significant portions of its coastal life sank beyond reach? And what does it mean to inherit, as so many cultures have, a story of a world drowned and a remnant saved, and to wonder whether that story is metaphor, or whether somewhere far back, before the chronicles, before the temples, before even the figurines, it was something a child once heard from a grandmother who had run, breathless and wet, from a rising line of water that should not have been rising? These are not questions that close. They open. And the next thing they open onto is the matter of what was inherited, and by whom, and under what name, when the older worlds had at last gone quiet beneath both water and conquest. There is a passage in Herodotus, the so-called father of history, writing in the 5th century before the Common Era, in which he speaks almost in passing of a people he calls the Pelasgians. He says that the Greeks, before they were Greeks, learned much from this older population that had inhabited the lands around the Aegean before them. He says that the names of many of the gods and certain rites and certain forms were of Pelasgian origin, and that the Pelasgians had once dwelt across nearly all of what would become Greek territory. He says that they spoke a language different from Greek, a barbarian tongue in his terms, which simply meant a non-Greek tongue, and that fragments of these older people still survived in his own day, in remote pockets, speaking words his contemporaries could not understand. Herodotus does not give a comprehensive account of the Pelasgians, and he is sometimes inconsistent in what he says about them. Other ancient writers, Homer, Thucydides, Strabo, mention them as well, in scattered references, often contradictory. They appear in the oldest layers of Greek literature as a kind of background presence, the people who were there before, whose traces remain in place names and in the genealogies of cities, but whose identity has already, by the classical period, become hazy. They are in a sense the first written acknowledgement that someone had been on the Greek peninsula and the Aegean islands before the Greeks themselves. Modern scholarship has spent more than 2 centuries trying to make sense of these references. Who were the Pelasgians? Were they a single people, or was the term simply a Greek shorthand for any of the older non-Greek populations of the region? Were they connected to the Minoans of Crete, who built the great palaces at Knossos and Phaistos, and whose script, the still undeciphered Linear A, encodes a language that has not yet yielded its meaning? Were they connected to the Mycenaeans' own pre-Greek substrate? Were they descendants of the same broad world that had produced Vinča and Cucuteni-Trypillia, the world of old Europe in its later phases? There is a kind of evidence, oblique but persistent, that points to something real beneath the Greek surface. It is the evidence of substrate words. When linguists examine the vocabulary of ancient Greek, they find a substantial number of words, particularly words connected to the landscape, to plants, to crafts, to certain religious concepts, that do not have clear Indo-European etymologies. Words ending in distinctive patterns, terms ending in enthos and ssos, like Corinthos and Knossos and Hyacinthos, names of places, names of plants, names of gods that the Greeks themselves admitted, at times, were inherited rather than invented. The very name of Athena, the patron goddess of Athens, has resisted convincing Indo-European derivation. So has the name of Dionysus, despite the suffix that suggests divinity. The mountain Olympus itself bears a name that is not, by the standard reconstructions, a native Greek word. What this means, taken together, is that the Greek language as it is spoken in the Iliad and the Odyssey and the works of the great tragedians is a language that has absorbed an enormous amount of pre-Greek vocabulary. Vocabulary it cannot have invented, vocabulary that must have come from someone who was there first. The Greeks who became Greeks did not arrive into a vacant landscape and name everything from scratch. They arrived into a populated world, and they took, as conquerors and migrants almost always take, the names that were already attached to the rivers, to the harbours, to the shrines on the hills, to the herbs that grew in the meadows. They took the names, and over time they forgot, mostly, where the names had come from. The same pattern, with local variations, can be traced across much of Europe. There are substrate elements in the Romance languages, in the Celtic languages, in the Germanic and Slavic and Baltic tongues, fragments that linguists believe are inheritances from the older, pre-Indo-European populations, layered into the new languages as they spread across already inhabited lands. Place names, in particular, are notoriously stubborn. They tend to outlast the populations that gave them. A river's name, once spoken by a people, can pass intact through 3 or 4 successor languages, the meaning forgotten but the syllables preserved. Across modern Europe, hundreds of river names, the Rhine, the Rhone, the Danube, many others, have been argued to derive from substrate sources older than the Indo-European arrival, words from languages that no human being has spoken for thousands of years and yet whose ghosts still pass the lips of every traveller who names the water. There is something almost vertiginous in this realization. To speak the name of a place is sometimes to speak the surviving syllable of a vanished tongue. To say Athens or Corinth or Knossos or Olympus is to repeat without knowing it a word that may once have meant something to a people of old Europe whose language is otherwise entirely lost. The cities have changed hands many times. The languages have layered over one another, but the syllables persist like a kind of acoustic fossil, and the gods themselves, at least some of them, show signs of the same kind of inheritance. The Greek pantheon, as it is known from later mythology, contains figures that fit easily into the Indo-European patterns. Zeus, the sky father, whose name shares a root with the Latin Iupiter and the Sanskrit Diaus Pitar, the warrior gods, the riders, the thunder throwers. But it also contains figures that sit oddly within that scheme. Athena, springing fully armed from the head of Zeus in a story that has every appearance of being a later attempt to integrate her into the patriarchal pantheon, a goddess of weaving and wisdom and crafts, of the olive, of the city, with strong intimations of an older and originally independent identity. Dionysos, with his ecstatic rites, his wandering processions, his connection to women's mysteries that the male civic order tried, again and again, to suppress and tame, who looks, in many readings, like a survival of an older fertility deity who could not be wholly displaced, and so was incorporated. Demeter, with her grieving search for her daughter, her mysteries at Eleusis, her deep connection to grain and to the cycles of growth and death, bearing every hallmark if Maria Gimbutas's reading, or any of its more cautious successors hold any water, of an older mother goddess whose worship had simply gone too deep into the soil of the land to be uprooted. What this suggests, taken in sum, is that the relationship between Greek civilization and what came before it was not the relationship of a fresh creation to empty space. It was the relationship of a complex compromise, a layering, a renaming, a partial absorption of the older into the newer. The Greeks built their temples on hills that had already been sacred for thousands of years. They worshipped in modified form gods whose oldest faces would have been familiar to the makers of the Vinča figurines. They spoke a language whose vocabulary was a palimpsest, with the older script still half legible beneath the newer. And what is true of Greece is true, in different ways, of the other civilizations that followed. The substrate is everywhere, once one begins to notice it. The pattern of a newer dominant culture overwriting an older one, while incorporating, renaming, and quietly forgetting whatever was useful from the older world, is one of the most consistent features of human history. So consistent that one begins to wonder whether it is, in some sense, a structural feature, a kind of rule by which civilizations always relate to those they replace. If so, then what was done to old Europe was not unique. It was simply, perhaps, the first instance on this scale that the modern eye has been able to recover. But it would not be the last, and the architects of forgetting in the centuries to come would refine their craft. There is a quieter form of conquest than the spear and the horse, and in some ways it is the more lasting form. It is the conquest of memory. It is the long, patient work by which the records of an older world are not destroyed all at once, but gradually edited, reframed, demoted, allowed to fall out of copy, allowed to fade from the curriculum, kept only in the form that fits the new story. By the time the work is finished, no one alive can quite say what was lost, because no one alive can quite remember what had been there to lose. The civilizations that followed the steppe migrations into Europe, the early Greeks, then the Romans, then the Christian empires that grew out of late Rome, all participated, each in its own manner and with its own emphasis, in this slow editing of what came before. None of them set out in any consciously coordinated way to erase old Europe from human memory. The mechanism was subtler than that. It worked through the ordinary processes by which any culture maintains itself, by deciding what is worth teaching to children, what is worth copying onto fresh papyrus or parchment when the old scrolls began to crumble, what is worth carving into stone where stone would last, what is worth letting go. Consider the Roman period, across the lands that had once been Cucuteni-Trypillia and Vinča territory, Dacia, Moesia, Thrace. The Romans came as imperial masters, building roads and forts and administrative centres, mapping the landscape into provinces, recording it in their own language and their own categories. The earlier inhabitants were classified and described, but always from outside, always as barbarians whose customs were curious or appalling, never as the bearers of an inheritance worth preserving. The local sanctuaries were sometimes assimilated, sometimes overwritten with Roman temples, sometimes simply allowed to decay. Local oral traditions, lacking the prestige of writing, faded into folklore. By the time Rome itself began to falter, and the legions withdrew from the Danubian frontier in the 3rd century of the Common Era, what remained of any direct memory of the old civilizations was already attenuated almost to invisibility. Then came the long centuries of Christianization, beginning in the 4th century, accelerating after the conversion of Constantine, spreading slowly across the rural populations of Europe across the next 1,000 years. A new framework of meaning came to overlay the older landscapes. Sacred places became churches or were destroyed. Sacred groves were felled. Local deities, where they could not be expelled, were rebranded as saints, their festivals quietly absorbed into the Christian calendar. Pagan ritual implements, when they came to light in the soil, were viewed with suspicion or contempt or, at best, antiquarian curiosity. The libraries of late antiquity, which had preserved fragments of older knowledge in the form of Greek and Roman scholarly works that themselves drew on yet older sources, were copied selectively. Manuscripts that did not seem useful or compatible with the new dispensation were sometimes scraped clean and overwritten, the so-called palimpsests, in which the older text survives only as a faint shadow beneath the newer one, recoverable, if at all, only by the most painstaking modern techniques. This, perhaps, is the most precise image for what happened to old Europe across the long centuries. It became a palimpsest. The older inscription was not entirely erased, but it was overwritten, scraped, written upon again. The newer texts have been read and studied for generations. The older text beneath them has only begun to be glimpsed in the past 100 years, as the spades of archaeologists and the lenses of aerial photographers and the centrifuges of ancient DNA laboratories have allowed for the first time the faded undertext to come back into partial focus. There are in the historical record occasional moments where the act of overwriting becomes briefly visible. The destruction of pagan sanctuaries by zealous bishops in the 4th and 5th centuries, sometimes recorded with pride in the chronicles of the Church. The closure of the philosophical schools of Athens by the Emperor Justinian in 529 of the Common Era, which extinguished one of the last institutional channels through which older Greek learning was transmitted in continuity. The sacking of the Great Library of Alexandria, which happened not in a single dramatic event but in a series of catastrophes across centuries, each of which removed some portion of what had been gathered there from the ancient world. The careful bonfires at which medieval inquisitors, in much later centuries, would consume the books and bodies of those whose knowledge was deemed dangerous to the prevailing order. None of these events in itself was the cause of the disappearance of old Europe from common memory, but each of them is an example of the kind of mechanism by which any older world can be selectively forgotten. And cumulatively, over many centuries, such mechanisms reshape the field of what is rememberable. They establish what is canonical and what is heretical, what is admissible as evidence and what must be dismissed, what may be taught in the universities and what must be confined to the disreputable margins of speculation. It is worth pausing on this point because it bears on the present. The history that any of us inherits is not a transparent reflection of what happened. It is a curated selection, shaped by the institutions that have done the curating. In the case of European prehistory, those institutions have included, at various times, classical antiquity itself, with its preference for its own self-image as the fountainhead of civilization, the Christian Church with its theological framing of pagan pasts, the colonial empires of the modern era with their civilizational narratives that placed Europe at the apex of human development, and the academic establishments of the 19th and 20th centuries with their own institutional habits and prejudices. Each of these in turn has emphasized certain stories and de-emphasized others. None of them has had a particular institutional interest in promoting the visibility of a vanished European civilization that did not fit the Greek to Roman to Christian narrative arc. This is not a conspiracy. There is no need to imagine secret cabals deliberately suppressing the truth of old Europe. The mechanism is more ordinary, more humdrum, more difficult to dramatize, and therefore more difficult to resist. It is the mechanism by which any institution privileges the stories that confirm its own legitimacy. It is the mechanism by which the present always slightly remakes the past in its own image. It is the mechanism by which the older inscription is gently, patiently, almost lovingly scraped away. And yet, here's the interesting thing, the older inscription does not entirely disappear. It survives sometimes in unexpected places. It survives often in the very margins where official institutions have not paid much attention. It survives in folk practices that are too humble to be worth suppressing. It survives in the patterns embroidered on a peasant grandmother's apron in the steps of a village dance whose origins no dancer can explain, in the words of a charm muttered against the evil eye, in the carved beam above a cottage doorway, in the painted egg given to a child at the spring festival. In 10,000 small acts that no institution has ever bothered to standardize, the older world has gone on whispering, century after century, beneath the louder texts written above it. And it is to these small persistences, this underground transmission of an inheritance no one quite remembers receiving, that the search for old Europe must, in the end, also turn. In the villages of the Carpathian foothills, in the wooden churches of the Maramaris, in the embroidered shirts laid out on a wedding chest in a Ukrainian household, in the painted eggs prepared each spring across an arc of country that runs from Slovakia through Romania and into the Russian heartland, the same shapes appear and reappear with a quiet, almost stubborn insistence. Spirals, meanders, lozenges and triangles, stylized birds often double-headed, stylized snakes coiled or wavy, stylized trees with branching tops and roots, sometimes inhabited by small figures climbing or perched upon them, the mother holding her hands raised, palms outward, the horned animal frontally posed with its body filled by geometric patterns. These motifs do not belong, in any obvious sense, to the iconography of the Christianity that has been the official religion of these regions for more than 1,000 years. They sit on top of it, sometimes literally, embroidered along the hem of a shirt that will be worn to church, painted on the egg that will be blessed at the Easter altar. When ethnographers in the 19th and 20th centuries began to catalogue these patterns, they often did so with the assumption that they were simply decorative, the inherited folk vocabulary of a peasant aesthetic, lovely and curious but without particular semantic weight. The patterns were arranged into typologies, photographed, drawn, archived, sometimes celebrated as expressions of national character. For these motifs are deeply intertwined with the way modern Romanian, Ukrainian, Bulgarian, Serbian, and other identities have come to picture themselves. But the deeper question, where had these motifs come from, and why were they so consistent across regions that had been politically and religiously fragmented for centuries, was not always asked. When archaeologists began, in the second half of the 20th century, to lay the painted pottery of Cucuteni-Trypillia and Vinča and their related cultures alongside photographs of Carpathian embroideries and Ukrainian Easter eggs, the resemblance was difficult to dismiss. The same spirals, executed in the same essential rhythms, the same triangles arranged into the same compositional patterns, the same stylized vegetal motifs, the same horned animals frontally posed, the same mother figures with raised hands. The painted pottery was 6,000 years old. The embroideries had been stitched by women who had died within living memory. And yet the visual grammar was in many cases recognizably continuous, as though something had been transmitted hand to hand, mother to daughter year after year, through a chain of transmission that left almost no written record but had not, in fact, been broken. This is one of the strangest and most underexplored aspects of the long aftermath of old Europe. The official narrative of cultural rupture. The idea that the Indo-European arrival, followed by Romanization, followed by Christianization, had effectively erased the older world, is challenged at the level of the visual by a counter-narrative of remarkable continuity. Not in the great institutions of state and church where the new symbolic orders held sway, but in the household crafts of ordinary women and men the older symbols persisted. They persisted not because anyone was consciously trying to preserve a pre-Indo-European inheritance. Most of the women who embroidered these patterns through these centuries would have been astonished, and possibly offended, to be told their work was anything other than a pious expression of their Christian and national identities. but because the patterns had become simply what one did. They had become the shape of beauty itself. To embroider a shirt was to embroider these motifs because they were the motifs that made an embroidered shirt look right. This is how cultural memory often works at its deepest level. It is not preserved in books or in monuments. It is preserved in habits, in the way one's mother taught one to hold a needle and what shapes the needle was taught to make, in the way an egg was decorated for the spring festival with the same patterns one's grandmother used and one's grandmother's grandmother. The transmission is silent. It does not declare itself. It simply continues generation after generation, unconsciously faithful to a vocabulary whose original meanings have long since faded. Some of those meanings have been at least partially recovered by patient comparative study. The spiral, for example, appears in nearly every prehistoric tradition of old Europe and persists with extraordinary vigour in modern folk art. It has been variously interpreted as an image of cyclical time, of the journey of the soul, of the unfolding of life, of the spiralling movement of cosmic forces. None of these interpretations can be confirmed, but the consistency of the symbol across millennia suggests it carried real weight. The double-headed bird, found on Vinča pottery and still embroidered on Romanian peasant blouses, has been read as an image of the soul or of a cosmic guardian. The mother figure with raised hands, found in clay form in the earliest old European sites, and still painted onto modern eggs and stitched onto modern textiles, may carry in its echoing repetition some distant inheritance of the goddess Maria Gimbutas was so determined to recover. There is a phenomenon that linguists call the substrate effect, in which an older language, even when officially replaced by a new one, leaves traces in the pronunciation, the grammar, the vocabulary of its successor. What is observed in the folk arts of the regions that were once old Europe seems to be a substrate effect of a different kind, a visual substrate, a symbolic substrate, surviving beneath the surface of every overlay that history has placed upon it. Roman Europe wrote over it. Christian Europe wrote over it. Modernity has written over it. And yet, on the painted egg held up to morning light in a Carpathian kitchen, the spiral still spirals, the bird still has two heads, and the woman with raised hands still stands at the centre of the design, where she has stood, perhaps, for 7,000 years. This is not proof of anything definitive. The motifs could have been independently reinvented at later dates. The continuity could be partial, broken, restored only in the ethnographic imagination. But the weight of the visual evidence is hard to ignore, and it raises a particular question about the nature of historical erasure. Is it possible to fully erase a civilization? Or does some part of it always survive, going underground when the official channels are closed to it, travelling through the unofficial channels of women's craft, children's games, peasant ritual, until its surfaces is perhaps thousands of years later, perhaps in fragments no one can fully reassemble, into the awareness of those who finally come looking. The answer on the evidence of these embroideries and these eggs seems to be that erasure is never quite complete. Something always escapes, something always finds a back staircase, a kitchen door, a humble corner of the household where the louder narratives do not bother to look. And in those corners, the older life continues its long whisper. There is yet another way in which the older world has survived, less visible to the eye than embroidery, but, in its own way, more intimate. It has survived in the very bodies of the people who now live across the lands that were once old Europe, in the cells of every modern Romanian, Bulgarian, Ukrainian, Serbian, and, in varying proportions, in the cells of almost every European of any nationality. Fragments of the genome of the older populations endure, mixed and recombined and partially overlaid by the steppe ancestry that arrived later, but never wholly displaced. To understand the scale of what was lost, and what was carried forward in spite of all loss, the search must turn next to those whispers. The whispers no embroidery can show, but that every cell of a living human body still carries within it. In the late 1990s and the early years of the present century, a quiet revolution began to take place in the laboratories of a handful of geneticists working on something called ancient DNA. The technique, in essence, was the recovery of genetic material from prehistoric bones, material that had survived in fragments, in the dense bone of the inner ear, in tooth roots, in the cool dark of cave deposits and burial chambers, and the sequencing of that material against the genomes of modern populations. In the early years, the work was painstaking, expensive, and limited to a small number of well-preserved samples. By the second decade of the 21st century, technical advances had reduced the cost and increased the yield to the point that thousands of ancient genomes were being published year after year by laboratories in Boston, Copenhagen, Jena, Leipzig, Vienna, and elsewhere. The picture that has emerged from this flood of data has rewritten, in the most literal sense, the story of European populations. The earliest layer in the genetic record is the layer of the original European hunter-gatherers. Small bands of people who survived the last ice age in scattered refugia and recolonized the continent as the glaciers retreated. Their genomes, recovered from skeletons in places like Lochbourg in Luxembourg and Cheddar Gorge in England, reveal populations that often had dark skin, dark hair, and strikingly blue eyes, a combination that does not match any modern European population precisely, but echoes through fragments of the modern gene pool. These people were the long inhabitants of the continent. Their tools, their cave paintings, their burials extend back tens of thousands of years. Then, beginning around 8,000 or 9,000 years before the Common Era, came a new layer, the early farmers, whose ancestral homeland was Anatolia. Genomic analysis has shown that the spread of agriculture across Europe was not primarily the result of older hunter-gatherers learning new techniques from neighbours. It was, in significant measure, the result of an actual movement of people. Anatolian farmers came west and north across the centuries, bringing wheat and barley and sheep and goats with them, and their genetic signature came to dominate large parts of Europe. The old European cultures that have been the subject of this long inquiry, Vinča, Cucuteni-Trypillia, Varna, and the rest, were, by ancestry, predominantly the descendants of these Anatolian farmers, with varying admixture from the older hunter-gatherer populations they encountered along the way. Their genomes, recovered now from sites across Bulgaria, Romania, Ukraine, and Hungary, show a relatively consistent ancestry profile across the long Old European phase, suggesting populations that had stabilized into a recognizable demographic unit over the course of 2,000 or 3,000 years. Then came the third layer, and it is the third layer that tells the story of the ending. Beginning around 4,500 years before the Common Era, accelerating sharply in the centuries that followed, a new ancestry profile entered Europe from the steppe lands north of the Black Sea. The Yamnaya people, with their burial mounds and their early wheeled vehicles and their increasing reliance on horses, carried a genetic signature that mixed earlier Eastern hunter-gatherer ancestry with influences from the Caucasus and from northern Iran. Their arrival in Europe, traced now in skeleton after skeleton, was demographically transformative. In some regions of Central and Northern Europe, the genetic signature of the previous Neolithic farmers was reduced within a few generations to a minority component of the local gene pool. In others, particularly in the south and west, the older ancestry persisted in greater proportion, but everywhere it was diluted, layered over, recombined. The most disconcerting finding from this work concerns the patterning of the Y chromosome. The Y chromosome passed only from father to son, is a particularly clear marker of male reproductive lines. Across much of Europe, the Y chromosome lineages that had been dominant during the Old European period, particularly the ones associated with the early Anatolian farmers, including a lineage known to geneticists as G2AA, were dramatically reduced after the Yamnaya arrival, and a new lineage, designated R1b in the standard notation, came to dominate. Within the span of a few centuries, the male genealogy of large parts of Europe had been essentially rewritten. The maternal lineages, traced through mitochondrial DNA, also shifted but did so less abruptly, suggesting that the women of the older populations were, to a much greater degree, integrated into the new social order, while the men of the older populations contributed far less to the next generations. What is one to make of this pattern? Geneticists have been cautious, and rightly so, in interpreting it. The data describe what happened to the genomes. They cannot, on their own, describe how it happened. Possibilities range from violent conquest and the killing or enslavement of male competitors, to disease epidemics that disproportionately devastated the settled populations and left the more mobile incoming groups relatively unscathed, to long processes of social displacement in which the prestige and resources of the incoming groups simply outcompeted the older lineages over many generations. Most likely the truth involves all of these factors, varying by region and by century. But whatever the mechanism, the result was demographic on a scale that even the most pessimistic interpreters of the archaeological record had not previously imagined. There is, however, another side to this story, and it deserves equal weight. The older ancestries did not vanish. They were diluted, but they were not extinguished. In the genome of a modern Romanian, perhaps 30 to 40% of the ancestral signal still derives from the early European farmers, the people of Vinča, of Cucuteni, of Varna. In the genomes of populations from the Aegean and the southern Balkans, the proportion is often higher. Even in the more steppe-dominated populations of Central and Northern Europe, the genetic memory of the Anatolian farmers and the original European hunter-gatherers persists at meaningful levels. The peoples of old Europe were not annihilated, they were absorbed. And this, in its own way, is one of the most poignant findings of all. The civilization disappeared as a distinct cultural entity. Its cities went unbuilt, its painted pottery ceased to be made, its language fell out of use, but its people, in the literal biological sense, did not disappear. They became part of the new populations that overlaid them. Every modern European, in greater or lesser proportion, carries in his or her cells the genetic inheritance of those long-vanished settlements on the Danube and the Dniester. Every modern European, whether they know it or not, is in some measure a descendant of the makers of the figurines, the weavers of the spiral pottery, the miners of Ibunar, the burying community of Varna with their gold and their silent dead. There is a strange consolation in this thought, and there is a strange grief in it as well. The consolation is that nothing of the body is ever quite lost. The genome is a long, faithful chronicle, capable of being read across many thousands of years. The grief is that the genome, however faithful, cannot recover what was carried in mind and mouth and memory. The body remembers in cells. The civilization is remembered, if at all, in fragments, in the embroideries on a shirt, in the spiral on an egg, in the syllables of a place name, in the bones of a man buried 6,000 years ago, beneath a small 1.5 kilograms of carefully shaped gold. The pattern of what happened to old Europe is not, as it turns out, a unique pattern in human history. It has happened, with local variations, again and again in every part of the world where complex civilizations have flourished and then been overlaid by others. And to recognize this is to begin to see the story of old Europe not as an isolated tragedy, but as the most thoroughly documented instance of a process that may be in some sense structural to the entire human past. Across the river valleys of what is now Pakistan and northwestern India, beginning around 2600 years before the Common Era and continuing for some 7 centuries afterward, there flourished a civilization whose scale rivals anything contemporary in Mesopotamia or Egypt. The Indus Valley civilization, sometimes called the Harappan after one of its first discovered cities, built urban centres of astonishing complexity. Mohenjo-Daro, Harappa, Dholavira, Rakhigarhi, and dozens of other sites have been mapped and excavated, revealing carefully planned grids of streets, advanced systems of drainage and water management, standardized weights and measures, and a script, still undeciphered, that appears on thousands of small carved seals. The civilization spread across an area larger than that of Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. And then, beginning around 1900 years before the Common Era, it gradually unravelled. The cities were abandoned, the script ceased to be used, the trading networks dissolved. By the time the Vedic-speaking peoples appear in the historical record of the subcontinent, the Indus Valley civilization had become a memory so faded that it would not be properly recovered until British surveyors in the 1820s and again more thoroughly in the 1920s began to dig at the strange mounds the local people called by names whose meanings had also long been lost. Why did the Indus civilization disappear? The current best understanding involves a combination of factors: shifts in monsoon patterns leading to the failure of crucial rivers like the now vanished Sarasvati system, climatic deterioration that strained the agricultural base of the cities, possibly accompanied by the same broad Indo-European migrations that were transforming Europe at roughly the same period. Whatever the precise cause, the result was a profound rupture, and the civilization that followed in the same lands, the Vedic and later Hindu traditions, built upon the older substrate while remembering very little of it consciously. The Indus script, despite a century and more of attempts, has resisted decipherment. The names of the cities are not the names their inhabitants called them. The languages spoken there are not in any confirmed way recoverable. The pattern of erasure that characterized Old Europe is repeated, with local variations, on the banks of the Indus. Or consider Catalhoyuk, in central Anatolia, where between roughly 7,400 and 6,200 years before the Common Era, a remarkable settlement housed several thousand people in tightly packed houses entered through openings in the roof. The walls of those houses were covered with murals: bulls, vultures, hunting scenes, abstract patterns, and burials were placed beneath the floors, the dead resting under the feet of the living. The settlement endured for more than 1,000 years, and then, like the old European mega-settlements that would follow it in time and pattern, it was abandoned. Its people scattered. Its murals went into the dark. Its name, like the names of the old European cities, is the name modern archaeologists gave it. The actual name, in whatever language its inhabitants spoke, is gone. Or the Green Sahara. There was a period between roughly 10,000 and 5,000 years before the Common Era when the great desert that now stretches across the breadth of North Africa was something else entirely. Rivers ran through it. Lakes filled what are now arid basins. Vast grasslands sustained populations of giraffes, hippopotamuses, elephants, and human beings whose paintings and engravings still survive on the rock faces of the Tassili Nanajer Plateau and similar sites, depicting hunters, herders, dancers, women in elaborate headdresses, scenes of a life that was clearly settled and substantial. Then, beginning around 6,000 years before the Common Era, the climate shifted, the rains failed, the lakes dried, and the vast grasslands became, within a few thousand years, the desert that exists today. The human populations were forced eastward to the Nile Valley and southward to the savannas, contributing perhaps to the very civilizations of pharaonic Egypt that would eventually claim, in their own self-conception, to have arisen from the bare miracle of the river. What was happening in the Green Sahara is barely remembered even today in any popular account of the rise of civilization. The rock art remains, the story behind it has gone with the rain. The pattern repeats. A complex society, sometimes urban, sometimes networked across a wide region without clear urban centres, flourishes for a long span of time. It develops technologies, symbolic systems, religious practices. It does not write itself down in the durable form of stone inscriptions and dynastic chronicles, or it does so in a script that is later lost. It comes to an end, whether through climatic change, through the arrival of new populations, through internal stresses, through some combination of factors that scholars will argue about indefinitely. Its successors inherit some of its achievements while overwriting most of its memory. The civilization becomes at best a footnote in the records of those who came after, and often not even that. What this suggests is that the disappearance of old Europe is not the exception but the rule. It is what happens, with depressing regularity, when one human world is replaced by another. It is the structural condition of being a non-dominant culture in a transitional period. The civilizations that we know best from the ancient world, Sumer, Egypt, classical Greece, Imperial Rome, Han China, are the ones that happen to leave durable written records and to be remembered in some institutional form by the cultures that succeeded them. The civilizations that did not leave such records, or whose records were lost, are the ones that vanished from common memory. The vanishing has nothing necessarily to do with the actual sophistication or significance of those civilizations. Old Europe, by every available measure, was sophisticated and significant. The Indus Valley was sophisticated and significant. The peoples of the Green Sahara were sophisticated and significant. They're simply not remembered because the conditions for their remembrance were not preserved. This is a sobering thought. It implies that the picture of human history that any of us inherits is a heavily filtered picture, biased toward the civilizations that happen to write themselves down in surviving forms and that were succeeded by cultures with an interest in preserving their records. It implies that the dawn of civilization, as conventionally narrated, is not in fact the dawn but a particular slice of a long developing process, the slice that happened to be illuminated by surviving documents. There were dawns before this dawn. There were civilizations before the civilizations we count. The fact that they have left us less is not necessarily because they were less, but because the chain of transmission that might have preserved them was at some point broken. And if this is true of the past, what does it suggest about the present? What does it suggest about the long future, in which our own civilization may someday be a partially remembered substrate beneath someone else's narrative? What digital records, what languages, what physical structures, what social practices of the present moment will survive in continuous transmissions, those distant successors, and which will be lost in the next great rupture, whatever form that rupture takes? It is a question that should give pause to any culture confident in its own permanence. Old Europe was, in its way, confident in its own continuity for 2,500 years. The figurines accumulated, the pottery refined, the cities were burned and rebuilt and burned again, and presumably the people who burned them and rebuilt them imagined more often than not that the long pattern would continue indefinitely. It did not, and the question that hangs over this entire long inquiry is whether, in some essential sense, the pattern ever does. There is a particular silence that gathers over a place where something used to be. Stand on a Romanian hillside in late summer, in the long hour before dusk, where the wheat has been harvested and the stubble catches the low gold of the slanting sun, and the wind moves across what was once, 6,000 years ago, the central plaza of a settlement of perhaps 10,000 people. There is no monument, there is no marker, there is no plaque set into the ground announcing what happened here. There are only the faint discolorations in the soil that aerial photography revealed, and the occasional pottery sherd brought to the surface by a plough, and the long quiet of a landscape that has, since the cities were burned, been pasture and forest and field again, through the centuries that followed and through the empires that came and went, none of them aware that beneath their feet lay the traces of an older world they had not been told about. To stand on such a place is to feel, perhaps for a brief moment, the weight of what is meant by the word forgotten, not absent, not destroyed in any final sense. The bones are still there, the ash layers are still there, the patterns of houses are still there, recoverable to anyone with the patience and the tools to recover them. What is gone is the thread of memory that would have connected those traces to a continuous human awareness of what they were. The forgetting is not in the soil. The forgetting is in the minds of the living, and once that thread is broken, no amount of physical preservation quite restores it. The figurines come up from the earth, but they come up mute, severed from the network of meanings that once held them. They are reassigned to glass cases in museums, in cities the people who made them never knew existed. They are photographed and catalogued. They are studied with care and respect, but they are no longer part of a living world. They are evidence of a world that has ceased. And this raises, at the end of so long an inquiry, a question that is perhaps less about the people of old Europe than about those who inherit, whether they know it or not, the strange position of being their distant successors. What does it mean to live knowingly atop such a substrate? What changes, if anything, when one realizes that the foundation of what one calls Western civilization, with its proud lineage from Greece through Rome, through Christendom into the modern, is not in fact a foundation laid on bare ground, but a series of overwritings on much older texts that have been only partially recovered? What changes when one realizes that the language one speaks, whatever it happens to be, contains substrate words from tongues no one alive can name, that the patterns one finds beautiful contain echoes of symbols whose original meanings are unrecoverable, that the very cells of one's body carry in measurable proportions the genetic inheritance of populations whose stories have been forgotten? There is no immediate practical consequence, perhaps, to this realization. One does not eat differently or dress differently or walk down the street differently because one has come to know about old Europe. The buses run, the seasons turn, the world insists on its ordinary continuity. And yet something in the inner geography of the listener may shift even slightly when these things are taken in. The ground feels different. The confidence of any particular present moment to know itself as the inevitable culmination of all that came before is perhaps a little less easy to sustain. The phrase "the dawn of civilization" no longer arrives quite so smoothly to the tongue, because one has begun to suspect that there were many dawns, and that most of them have been forgotten, and that the one we have been taught to call the dawn is simply the earliest one our particular chain of records happens to preserve. There is something almost devotional in this kind of awareness, not religious in any conventional sense, but devotional in the older meaning of the word, a kind of attention paid to what has been, a kind of acknowledgement offered to those who came before and who are not now thanked, not now named, not now visible in any of the official catalogues of human achievement. To stand on the hillside in Romania, or to look at a painted Cucuteni vessel in the museum case in Iasi, or to consider the small clay figurine with her masked face and her geometric markings, and to allow oneself, for a moment, to feel that one is in the presence of a person whose hands shaped this thing, whose breath warmed it, whose mind held intentions that the figurine was meant to express. is to perform a small act of recovery that no formal historiography can quite accomplish. It is to grant existence briefly to a life that was lived 7,000 years ago in a place that has become a stubble field, by someone whose name is not known and will never be known, but who was indisputably a someone. This is perhaps the only restitution that can be offered to a vanished civilization. The cities cannot be rebuilt. The languages cannot be recovered without the keys that were never preserved. The continuous tradition cannot be revived, because too many of its threads were cut too long ago. But the silence around them can be acknowledged. The forgetting can be named. The fact that they were here, that they built and farmed and metallurgized and made beautiful things and burned their cities and walked away and built again, can be held in mind, even briefly, by those who have learned to know that they were here. And in that holding, something is preserved. Not the civilization itself, which is gone, but the recognition of its having been. The candle of attention is, after all, the only candle that any civilization ever has in the end to light its own existence by. Old Europe, while it lived, had its own candles, its own attentions, its own ways of making meaning, of marking the dead, of celebrating the seasons, of teaching children what mattered. Those candles have been out for thousands of years, but the awareness that they once burned, that something burned there, that for 2,500 years there was a complex, distinctive, peaceful, technologically inventive, symbolically rich human world that filled those river valleys and those Carpathian foothills with smoke and song and the cries of newborns and the slow laments for the dead. That awareness, when it is kindled in a single mind, is itself a small candle, lit in their honour, however late. The wind is moving across the stubble field. The sun is going down. Somewhere beneath the soil a clay figurine that no one has yet found is lying where she was dropped or placed 60 centuries ago, with her hands raised in a gesture whose meaning is no longer known. Perhaps she will be found one day and join the other thousands in the cases of the museums. Perhaps she will not. Either way, she is still there, still in the dark, still keeping her old vigil. And perhaps the only fitting response, at the close of a long inquiry into all that has been carried away from us in the long indifferent course of forgetting, is the simplest one: to pause, to listen in the gathering quiet for what cannot quite be heard, and to allow oneself the soft, half-grieving thought that the world is older than the world remembers, and that beneath every dawn we've been taught to call the first there is another, and beneath that another, and somewhere in the deep dark of those layered mornings, a hand once shaped a small clay figure, set her down upon a windowsill and turned away, never imagining that the silence would last so long.